In 1298, King Edward I of England launched a decisive campaign against the rebellious forces of Scotland, though the outcome did not yield the anticipated results. In the medieval tradition, kings leading their armies into battle was the norm, and Edward I spent most of his reign 1270 to 1307 on the battlefield, whether in Wales, Scotland, on the European continent, or in the Holy Land. In October 1297, having just reached a truce with King Philip IV of France in the Franco-Flemish War, he received shocking news. An English army had been defeated by Scottish spearmen at the Battle of Stirling Bridge on September 11th, and the victorious Scots had subsequently launched a cross-border raid into Durham. In March 1298, upon returning to England, Edward set up his headquarters in York and began to muster ground and naval forces from across his kingdom to suppress the northern rebels. Nicknamed Longshanks due to his imposing height 6 feet 2 inches, Edward had conquered Scotland with customary brutality. In 1296, he ordered the sack of the Scottish fortress at Berwick-upon-Tweed, a massacre so bloody that it was shocking even for the times. His subsequent attempt to strip Scotland of its national identity and place it under English guardianship only stirred more unrest. By mid-1297, violence erupted into full-scale rebellion on both sides of the Firth of Forth, led by the northern nobleman Sir Andrew Murray, or Murray, and the southern commoner William Wallace. To fund the impending campaign, Edward resorted to the usual feudal methods. He issued military summons to English and Scottish nobles, petitioned Parliament for new taxes to fund mercenaries, recruited infantry from Wales, pardoned criminals to bolster his army, and ordered supplies shipped from Ireland, to which he had inherited a lordship. Clearly, Longshanks would stop at nothing to raise funds. In 1290, he issued a decree expelling the entire Jewish population of England, estimated at 2,000 people. Under this edict, he confiscated any property they left behind and transferred their outstanding debts to his account. This brutal decree significantly swelled his treasury. The army Edward mustered in York was the largest invasion force assembled on the British Isles since the Roman general Julius Agricola conquered Britain. In the 1st century, Longshanks' army comprised 2,250 heavy cavalry and 12,900 infantry, more than half of whom were mercenaries. Of the infantry, only about 2,000 were English. The rest came from the Welsh interior and the Welsh border regions. Edward particularly valued the Welsh, considering them the bravest and most experienced infantry under his command. Riding a fully equipped black war horse, Edward led his personal guard across the Anglo-Scottish border, joining up with the assembled infantry and cavalry at Roxburgh in early July, then marching north towards Edinburgh. As a king well versed in logistics, he expected to encounter a large supply fleet en route from eastern English ports. As his multinational army advanced into central Scotland, Edward found Wallace's scorched earth tactics had left little in the way of supplies, and his soldiers and horses began to suffer from lack of provisions. Meanwhile, Wallace, now commanding the Scottish army alone after Murray's death at Stirling Bridge, wisely avoided a direct confrontation while shadowing the enemy's northward march. Unaware of the Scottish army's location, Edward pressed on through Lauder and Dalekit, reaching Kirkliston west of Edinburgh, where he halted. Bad weather and contrary winds had scattered the fleet carrying vital supplies, and by the time Longshanks' forces encamped, they were on the brink of starvation. Despite the size of Edward's army, discipline among the soldiers was lax. Welsh archers squabbled with Gascon crossbowmen, and some English knights threatened to defect and join Wallace, hoping to regroup and bolster his demoralized troops. The king withdrew to the outskirts of Edinburgh, but ongoing defections and disputes between English knights, Gascons, and Welsh further exacerbated the situation. On one occasion, Welsh soldiers rioted in a drunken stupor, though quickly suppressed by English infantry. The disturbance resulted in the deaths of 80 Welshmen and 18 Englishmen. Edward's campaign of 1298 was essentially stalled, and the Plantagenet monarch remained unaware of the enemy's position, weighing his options in the hidden Scottish camp at Carnduff Wood, south of Falkirk. Wallace realized that a direct confrontation with Edward's formidable army was untenable. Learning of Longshanks' plight, he decided either to launch a night raid on the English camp or harass the rearguard and supply trains as the enemy retreated. However, on July 21st, two Scottish earls who betrayed Wallace, jealous of him and eager for the king's favor, disclosed Wallace's intentions to Edward and revealed the Scottish camp's location just 15 miles west of Falkirk. "Thanks be to God, who has delivered me from every peril thus far," Edward was recorded as saying at the time. "These Scots need not follow me, for I shall go to meet them." That afternoon, Edward ordered the advance to Falkirk, though his soldiers were still hungry and under-provisioned. They likely preferred to fight the enemy rather than each other. Led by Longshanks' armored cavalry, the English host marched 10 miles and encamped at Burgmuir, east of Linlithgow, arriving late. The army spent the night armed and ready. They lay down to rest. English chronicler Walter of Gquestion recorded, using their shields as pillows and their weapons as blankets. Their horses tasted only the hard iron, each tightly tethered to its master, perhaps asleep during a night patrol. Edward's attendants lost control of his war horse, which trampled the sleeping king, breaking two of Longshanks' ribs and causing a commotion that roused the entire army. Someone shouted that they were under attack, though calm was quickly restored. The soldiers remained on high alert, seizing their renewed vigor. Edward, in pain, climbed into the saddle and led his army towards Falkirk before dawn. At dawn on July 22nd, the English vanguard spotted a column of spearmen on the heights of Reading Moor and assumed it to be the main Scottish force. Forming up quickly, the English army ascended the slope and crossed the ridge. Finding no enemy in sight, they stopped to set up a makeshift chapel on the banks of the West Quarter Burn. As Edward and Anthony Beck, the warrior Bishop of Durham, celebrated Mass, the morning mist lifted, and the English clearly saw the Scots assembling on a ridge about a mile south of Carnduff Wood. The sudden appearance of Longshanks' army prompted Wallace to decide against risking a disorderly retreat and instead to fight a defensive battle from the best position, with Carnduff Wood behind the Scots and a slope descending several hundred yards in front of them. Wallace, unlike at Stirling Bridge, found no natural or artificial terrain to enhance his defenses. Convinced the English would attack from all sides, he massed his 8,000 spearmen into four large, roughly oval formations called schiltrons. A schiltron was a hedgehog formation of ground-fixed spears connected by ropes. Historian Peter Truquare noted, "Not very mobile, and the only defense available to infantry against medieval cavalry charges. For English archers, it was an irresistible target, and the schiltrons needed protection by cavalry capable of dispersing enemy archers. In these circles, the Scottish spearmen arrayed themselves." Gquestion recorded, "Their spears slanted and linked together, facing outward around the perimeter of the circles." Some accounts claim the Scots set up wooden barriers in front, but whether Wallace had time for such preparations is doubtful. Wallace dispersed his 1,500 archers among the gaps between the four schiltrons, under the command of Sir John Stewart. These archers, trained in Selkirk and Ettrick forests, carried longbows equal in every respect to those of Wales and England. The Scots' weakness in long-range weapons stemmed mainly from a lack of men capable of using them. The Scottish cavalry, commanded by John's brother, Sir James Stewart, the High Steward of Scotland, numbered only about 500, similarly plagued by severe undermanning. These cavalry, dispatched by supportive Cummings and other earls, but notably absent on the battlefield, were composed of lower-ranking nobles and their retainers, seemingly not under Wallace's command. They massed on the Scottish right flank, close to and behind the right-wing schiltron, a position vulnerable to cavalry attack. Thus deployed on the ridge, The Scots waited quietly for the renowned English host. Nearly the entire Anglo-Norman knighthood was present to support Edward, but Longshanks' gallant knights did not know that heavy rain had turned the valley floor into a quagmire, unsuitable for cavalry combat. After Mass, Edward calmly suggested suspending action to pitch tents and feed the soldiers and horses, who had not eaten since setting out the previous afternoon. According to Guy-Esperot, his battlefield commanders advised the king against such a provocative display. "It is not safe, my lord, for there is only a very small stream between the two armies." Perhaps the eager knights had lost patience, maybe sensing their fervor for battle. Edward heeded his subordinates' advice. After invoking the Holy Trinity, he ordered the attack. The English host comprised 4 cavalry battle squadrons or divisions. The vanguard, led by English Marshal Roger Bigoti and the Earls of Lincoln and Hereford, included 18 standard-bearers knights leading their own troops and 430 knights and cavalry. They descended from Reading Moor, crossed the upper west quarter burn, and advanced directly north towards the Scottish defences. Soon after, the Bigoti cavalry crossed the Glen Burn. Their horses slipped and fell in the boggy valley bottom, abruptly halting their advance. After some confusion, the ray-formed vanguard skirted the western edge of the bog, continuing uphill. The English knights quickly reached the Scottish right flank, where Wallace's cavalry waited. Meanwhile, the Earl of Surrey, John de Warenne, who had failed at Stirling Bridge, led his 15 standard-bearers and 410 knights and cavalry following the vanguard, wisely circumnavigated the boggy lake, reached the enemy's front, and then also arrived at the Scottish right flank. Next to strike was the squadron commanded by warrior Bishop Bek, including 20 for standard-bearers and 400 knights and cavalry. Bek's cavalry also witnessed the vanguard's plight, keeping the west quarter burn to their left and skirting the bog eastward. As soon as they cleared the obstacle, many of Bek's forward cavalry, reckless and eager to engage the enemy, spurred their mounts and left their comrades behind. Bek did not let them attack piecemeal, but ordered the others to wait for Edward's squadron, the largest of the 4, with 43 standard-bearers and 850 knights and cavalry, covered by 100 mounted Gascon crossbowmen. Bek's deputy, former English Edinburgh Castle Governor Ralph Bassett, extremely arrogant, had no intention of waiting for the king and bluntly accused the bishop of excessive caution, ignoring Bek's attempts to restrain them. Bassett and other glory-seeking knights continued uphill towards the dense Scottish spearmen. As Bek's cavalry charged the spearmen waiting on the Scottish left flank, the ground trembled from the hooves of over 400 war horses, and Bigoti's vanguard challenged the cavalry on the Scottish right flank. Though equal in number to the English cavalry, the inexperienced Scots were defeated by Bigoti's heavily armored veteran knights and fled the battlefield in disgrace. Several contemporary accounts accuse the High Steward's cavalry of retreating without striking a blow, but a few brave knights did dismount and join the hollow Chilterons, fighting on foot. Having easily routed Wallace's cavalry, Bigoti's vanguard charged the enemy's right-wing Chilteron, while Bek's cavalry attacked the left flank. The Scots' tightly arrayed ranks easily repelled the ensuing heavy charges, their dense 15-foot spears forming an apparently impenetrable barrier. Unable to breach the dense wall of steel, both English cavalry units withdrew in good order, with minor losses of men and horses. Ray-formed, they turned their attention to the vulnerable Scottish archeress between the stationary Chilterons. Guy-Esperot described the ensuing chaos: the overwhelmed archeress fighting desperately around the body of their leader, Sir John Stuart, who accidentally fell from his horse and was killed. They could not withstand the well-armed English cavalry and war horses. A few surviving Scottish archeresses sought refuge among their spearmen companions. Thus, the stationary Chilterons were left unsupported, with no means to alleviate their seemingly impossible predicament. The battlefield conditions had greatly favored the English, and Edward had yet to employ his massive infantry force. Recalling his years of fighting spearmen in North Wales, Longshanks knew Wallace's Chilterons were sitting ducks. Casting aside any remaining caution, He threw his entire force into the attack on the beleaguered Scots. After reforming and replenishing his cavalry, Edward sent them to the enemy's flanks, then advanced his 500 Welsh longbowmen and 400 Gascon crossbowmen to a close line about 100 yards in front of the Scots. He then divided his 7,000 spearmen into two parts, deploying them on either side of the longbowmen. The English front line numbered nearly 13,000. A formidable sight. Then, Longshanks ordered his long-range units to unleash a continuous barrage of arrows, bolts, and stones, unable to carry shields for defense while wielding spears. Wallace's soldiers mostly wore rough homespun tunics. Few had helmets or any form of armor to protect them from the relentless, deadly rain of long-range attacks. The Scots particularly feared the English longbow arrows, which were accurate up to 200 yards, capable of penetrating chainmail and plate armor, and could even pin a knight to his horse from horseback at the center of the English line. Edward and Beck watched with satisfaction as their longbowmen, crossbowmen, and slingers unleashed wave after wave of attacks on the Scottish ranks. Soon, the exposed schiltrons began to suffer. Gaps appeared in the Scottish line, allowing English cavalry to break through and hack at the spearmen at close quarters. Edward finally sent in his spearmen for hand-to-hand combat. According to the English chronicler of the Lane or Cost Chronicle, despite being attacked from all sides, the remaining Scots held their ground and fought bravely. Inevitably, the first shattered schiltrons collapsed, and the survivors fled, pursued mercilessly by Edward's cavalry and Welsh spearmen. Under the urging of his lieutenants, Wallace followed them north into Carnduff Wood, then into the hills, leaving at least 7,000 dead Scots behind. Though the English lost only 2 knights, over 3,000 English infantry lay dead on the battlefield, a testament to the ferocity that Scots displayed in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Edward's campaign of 1298 involved enormous expense, and while it devastated Wallace's forces, it achieved little else and did not come close to ending the war. Determined to force the Scots to acknowledge his rule, Longshanks led a series of grueling campaigns between 1301 and 1304. Forcing many major nobles to submit. By mid-1304, Scotland was firmly in his grasp. English troops garrisoned its castles, and order was restored. After the brutal execution of Wallace in 1305, Edward hoped he had finally persuaded the Scots to cease hostilities. That hope was shattered in March 1306 when Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick and 7th Earl of Annandale, declared himself King of Scotland, reigniting the First War of Scottish Independence. Historian Simon Jenkins opines, Edward's military acumen was so high that, had he not been so brutally suppressing the Celtic regions, he might have achieved a consensus unity. Instead, he found himself ensnared in the familiar trap of English medieval monarchs, surrounded by resentful Celts and opportunistic French. Longshanks died of dysentery in 1307 while campaigning against Robert Bruce, who finally secured Scottish independence after 2 decades of hard fighting.